Or did I steal your spot?
I don't know.
Yeah, no, you're quite right. I'm happy to pretend to be Robin. But I don't think I do a very good job.
Confusion.
Yeah, exactly. Why don't I give you a presentation?
All right, well, good morning. Let's go ahead and get started. I'm Stephen Izal, the Vice President of Global Innovation Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. And I would like to welcome you to this event, What Works in Innovation Policy, Lessons from Europe. So, you know, it's been a fertile time for innovation policy globally, as countries around the world, including in the United Kingdom, Canada, China, and the European Union, amongst many others, have articulated new national innovation policies or strategies. Now, national innovation policies are designed to explicitly link innovation and technology commercialization with employment and economic growth in countries. They bring together a disparate set of policy issues around tax, trade, technology, university government relations, intellectual property, digital and physical infrastructure, to essentially constitute the ecosystem in which the enterprises and industries of companies can compete effectively in a global innovation economy. Interestingly, from Europe, as we argued in the book Innovation Economics, The Race for Global Advantage, which my colleague Rob Atkinson and I published from Yale University in September 2012, and which, by the way, everybody is required to read this book before entering any future ITIF event. This is required reading for everybody. But as we pointed out in this book, innovation policy, it really helps countries scale, incubate, grow, and attract industries and enterprises in the highest value-added sectors of economic activity. And Europe has, for the longest time, been extremely strong on innovation and technology policy. But perhaps historically, the regulatory and business environment hasn't been as strong to enable startups and enterprises to flourish within the strong ecosystem that Europe has for innovation. And of course, this has been called historically the European or the Swedish paradox around innovation. So it's a timely moment to talk about innovation policy globally, and particularly in Europe, where some of the best thinking on innovation policy is happening from around the world. So we are just delighted and honored today to have 5 wonderful speakers with us. What I'm going to do is introduce each of them in the order they'll speak. They'll talk for about 8 minutes each about the innovation policy activity in their countries. Then we'll turn it over to a moderated Q&A discussion amongst ourselves and then with the audience. But first, we'll hear from Dr. Robin Mishra, who was the head of the Science and Technology section of the German Embassy in Washington, D.C. He represents the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research, BMBF, since 2010, before serving as head of press and strategic communications for federal ministers Annette Schavan and Johanna Wanka. Before, Robin was a TV journalist and a prize-winning journalist where he won the Burns Prize and the Median Prize in 2009 for his articles. Robin has a PhD in law. Next, Andrew Price, who is the head of the United Kingdom's Science and Innovation Network in the United States, as well as regional manager for the Americas, where he leads a team of 14 science and innovation officers located in British consulates across major American cities. Previously, Andrew served Her Majesty's Treasury, the Department for Education, and also the Department for Business, Energy, and Industrial Strategy, working on ways to increase domestic productivity in the UK through interventions to support entrepreneurship and capital for small businesses. Andrew has a BSc in International Business and French from the University of Warwick. Next, we'll hear from Sigrid Johannessi, who is Counselor for Innovation, Technology, and Science at the Netherlands Embassy in Washington, where she is in charge of the Dutch Innovation Attaché Network in the USA and Canada, with offices in cities including San Francisco and Boston. Sigrid was previously founder and director of the Dutch national public-private startup organization Startup Delta, and she had been advisor to Nelly Cruz at the European Commission, working on the digital agenda for cybersecurity, e-government, e-health, smart cities, and innovation. Before that, she had worked in the Ministry of Economic Affairs in Holland. Sigrid actually is an architecture historian and has published numerous books, including one on Dutch architect Michael de Klerk, which I thought was fascinating, and I look forward to reading. Next, Mr. Clemens Mantel, who is the director of Austria's Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTA, He's held numerous posts worldwide for the Austrian Foreign Ministry, including focusing on cultural and scientific diplomacy in postings in Tehran, Iran, and Cairo. Before that, he coordinated Austria's membership in the executive board of UNESCO. And before coming to Washington, he was deputy spokesperson for the Austrian Foreign Ministry in Vienna. Last but not least, Mr. Peter Faltemig, who is Minister Counselor for Digital Economy Policies at the delegation of the European Union to the United States. He's been a senior manager at the European Commission since 1998, and before coming to Washington, he manned was the leading person on Europe's new Internet Policy and Investment Initiative, the flagship on next generation Internet. And prior to that, Peter had worked on international assignments for strategy firms, including American Management Systems and the European Space Agency in the Netherlands. Welcome, Peter. Thank you for joining us. With that, let me turn it over to you. Robin, the floor is yours. And thank you all for being here.
Okay, Stephen, Rob Atkinson, thank you for inviting us and me to this panel. And for developing this idea, because I would like to start on a more personal observation and a more personal note. When you read the newspapers and many of the reports that are coming out on innovation, you easily get the impression that there are only two countries left in the race for innovation, which is US and China. And you may have read the article in the Washington Post yesterday. I think Europe is mentioned at one point, but you don't hear too much about it. And so I would really like to make a strong plea: don't forget old Europe, as a former Secretary of Defense called it, because we have something to offer, and I think Germany and all the other countries strongly feel that there are lessons that you can learn from Europe, as well as there are, of course, lessons that we can learn from the US. If you don't believe me, watch at the figures. So Germany has reached the EU strategic goal of investing 3% of GDP for R&D. The EU average is around 2%, and I have to admit there are two countries who have a stronger share of GDP, which is Austria, Clemens will talk about it, and Sweden, and I'm glad that Maria is here as well. So, but that's a good figure. You will have heard about our Chancellor, Angela Merkel, who has become Chancellor in 2005. And since she has taken office, the budget of the Federal Ministry for Education and Research has more than doubled from 8.5 to more than 17 billion euro. And there are studies that really suggest that there is a direct correlation between innovation environment, strong economy, and low unemployment. When I thought about how I could convey the message or tell about the strength of the German or system, or perhaps other European systems as well, perhaps there are 2 points that are important. If you watch at the R&D figures, you will see that 1/3 of the R&D investments comes from the public sector and 2/3 of from the private sector. It's more or less the share that you have here in the US. And so I think the combination, and these are my 2 points, the strong role of industry first, and the reliable public R&D funding, which is combined with a national innovation strategy called high-tech strategy, I will talk about that later, is kind of the mix that makes Germany an interesting player in innovation and research. Let me perhaps start with the reliable public R&D funding. I think that's perhaps the most important message that I personally can convey, because I come from the Ministry of Education and Research, and there are strong investments. And what is interesting is that these investments are built on 3 central pillars. So there are so-called pacts, which means the kind of contracts between the government and the players in the innovation field. One is the Pact for Research and Innovation. This pact between the federal government, the regional governments, and the different research organizations like Fraunhofer, Helmholtz, Max Planck, Leibniz, DFG, so German Research Foundation, there's a kind of contract saying that all these organizations have a guaranteed 3% increase per year of their budget. And they can rely on that. At one point it was a 5% increase, now it's a 3% increase. And for the next years, they know that, and they can add strategies, they can add new programs, they can really work on a reliable basis. So that's the Pact for Research and Innovation, the first pillar. The second pillar is the so-called Higher Education Pact. In Germany, we realized that a lot of people want to study now, so we had a strong tendency to go to an apprenticeship first, and now we have 50-50 situations. So a lot of young people feel that it's worth to go to university, and so the universities had to be financed. And there's another pact, the Higher Education Pact, which guarantees sustainable funding for each additional student, which is also very successful and which will also be continued. And there's a third pillar, which is the so-called Excellence Initiative, which is now called Excellence Strategy, which aims at financing top-level research, improve the quality of German universities and research organizations. There are different pathways. I think that may be too complicated for the first round, but there are clusters of excellence and universities of excellence. You may know that Germany doesn't have really universities which are in the top in the rankings, but the reason is that we have so many good regional universities, but none of them is so big that it would appear in these rankings. But our strength may be that the gap between smaller and bigger universities is not that big, and that you can easily get a good degree at any of them. So these are the pillars: Pact for Research and Innovation, Higher Education Pact, Excellence Initiative or Excellence Strategy. And this is combined with a national strategy, so-called high-tech strategy, which is mission-oriented. That means that there are fields, scientific fields, which are defined, and the government tries to highlight these fields, which doesn't mean that all the money goes into these fields, but additional money may land in these areas. And these areas and actual priorities are digital economy and society, sustainable economy and energy, innovative world of work, healthy living, intelligent mobility, and civil security. And you can break it down to other areas. So this is the first part, reliable R&D funding from the public side. The second is the strong role of industry, which contributes 2/3 to the R&D budget. Germany's share of world trade in research-intensive goods has even increased in 2016, and also the number of people employed in R&D. So there was a sharp rise in the last years too. One of the reasons may be something that you may have heard of, which is the so-called Industry 4.0, which also started as a concept coming out of this high-tech strategy, which means that the classical German strength in mechanical, electrical engineering, for example, are used to add another layer, which is information technology, smart factory, areas like this. I could also talk more about this, but I will leave it at that. There are public-private partnerships in many areas. You may know, for example, that the Fraunhofer Society was built to foster cooperation between the private and the public sector. And I already mentioned the German apprenticeship system, so it may be important for you to learn that in Germany there are these two ways for your career, the apprenticeship system on the one hand and the higher education on the other hand. And still 50% of students go into this apprenticeship system. And if you like, you can book me for another panel on apprenticeship. I've done this several times, and it's really amazing that people in the US are really interested in how we are doing that, because it's this earn while you learn concept. So the company is really investing something in your education. The government is funding the public vocational schools. And this is also a tool that guarantees that we have a skilled workforce which really can create innovation. These are the positive points. There are a lot of messages that we can also highlight afterwards. Perhaps my last point is that the new government, which is the fourth Merkel government now, has strong ambitions to do even more. So they are planning to adopt tax incentives for research and development, will be kind of your R&D tax credit, but more designed to small and medium-sized enterprises. There will be huge investments in digital infrastructure and innovation, and AI strategies in the making. There will be probably an AI Institute of Germany and France. We try to build it together. There are strong links to the EU programming, and Peter will tell us more about that. As one of Germany's weaknesses seem to be that we have more incremental change compared to disruptive innovations, there is a big discussion about creating a kind of agency that accelerates the pace of innovation. You know the DARPA and ARPA-E model here, and in Germany there are a lot of people working on that at the moment, and the DARPA and ARPA-E models play an inspiring role in that. And the 3 pacts that I mentioned, so the 3 pillars, will be continued, and there will be added additional money to them. Overall, the new coalition government aims at setting a new goal of reaching 3.5% of GDP in R&D. Let's see, it's a very ambitious goal, but they have set it, and let's see if we can reach that. A last remark. There is a nice article in Nature about the German innovation environment. It appeared before the elections, but it highlighted one interesting point, which may be important for all the facts and figures that I mentioned to you, which is that there is really agreement across the political spectrum to finance and fund education and research. So it didn't really matter who wins the election in this field. So I don't say that it will stay like that, but at this point we have a strong agreement with all the political players that we have to do more. And the discussion how to invest it, of course we have it, but in general there's a strong agreement that there has to be public funding, and that innovation in industry is very important. Yeah, this was interesting to read, and I was happy to read that. And I admit that it was a very positive description of what's going on in Germany, but I think we can discuss about other things afterwards. So I will leave it at that, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Robin, for that great overview of the innovation landscape in Germany. Andrew.
Morning, everybody. So yeah, I'm Andrew Price. I head our science and innovation team here in the US. I'm based in the embassy here in Washington. I'm going to cover some of the similar themes that Robin and I suspect some of the other panelists will about what's happening in the UK at the moment. And I certainly kind of agree with Robin's plea to think about Europe and think about the richness of experience and lessons that are coming out of the European economies, and how some of the lessons that we learn are relevant to what's happening here in the US and vice versa. And I'll come into that maybe a little bit at the end, but I principally want to do 3 things. I want to give you a little bit of context to the British innovation system. I think it's quite difficult to understand what's happening in a country without understanding some of the history. What does the current environment look like in the UK? And then thirdly, what are some of the challenges that we face? And some of those challenges might be specific to the UK. Some of them I think are shared. So firstly, the context to British innovation. I think British governments have a pretty long history of supporting innovation, and our track record of innovation, invention and enterprise goes back hundreds of years. But I think since the 1970s in particular, there's been more of a focus, or less of a focus, on active intervention, active support for individual sectors or individual trades or individual technologies, but more of a focus on creating the right business environment to support innovation and making general R&D investments to support that. Less about activism and direct intervention. And then another more recent kind of major milestone in terms of policy thinking, I think, is the 2008 financial crisis. And I think since then, successive governments have wanted to take a more active and thoughtful approach to industrial policy. And there's certainly a commitment and a desire, and this has been in place since 2008, to take a more sophisticated but perhaps also more realistic view of the role that government plays in innovation. So rather than having debates about whether government should or shouldn't have a role in innovation at all, talking more about the fact that government does have a role and the hand of government does make a difference, and thinking about how regulation, about how tax, about how nudges that the government makes do have that significant impact. Just thinking a bit about the why the UK is good at innovation. There's three kind of basic foundational points I'd like to highlight just about the nature of our economy. So firstly, our economy is very service-based. So about 80% of the GDP in the UK is derived from services-based activity. And that means a lot of our focus and a lot of our attention is around innovation for service-based activities, and increasingly less of a focus on traditional sectors, traditional manufacturing, and other bits of the economy that were stronger in decades and centuries gone by. The second thing is our public innovation policy and system is actually pretty centralized compared to other countries, and I think compared to how the landscape looks here in the US. Yes, we have local economic development actors and players, but a lot of the policy, a lot of the funding, a lot of the principles are set by national government. And I think that's a product of our political history. It's a product of the size of our country, but support is generally quite centralized. The one thing I would just add to that in terms of the devolved nations, so Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, they all have their own really distinct and powerful role to play in setting innovation in their countries. But also a lot of the policy and funding is set at a UK-wide level. And then thirdly, and Robin kind of touched on this in his point about support for R&D or support for innovation, politically speaking, there's pretty widespread support across political divides in the UK for innovation and for a role for government. So the kind of debates you see playing out here between Republicans and Democrats, for example, about the role for government, you don't really see in the UK these days. Yes, we have a pretty healthy debate about whether government should be intervening in markets and the consequences of doing so, but there's not a principled position that government shouldn't have a role in innovation. I think it's widely accepted that government can do good by providing support and funding for innovation. So that's a bit of the context, but what does the current environment for innovation look like in the UK? Firstly, there are a number of kind of foundational strengths I would point to that make the UK a pretty supportive environment for innovation. We've got a generally healthy and welcoming positive business environment. We're pretty high up on the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index. We're 5th on the Global Innovation Index, which is pretty good for a larger economy. Very business-friendly tax regime. We have, I think, the lowest, or certainly one of the lowest, corporation tax rates in the G7 and of any advanced economy. Pretty modern IP and legal system. Robin touched on this for Germany. We also have a very strong kind of talent pipeline and talent pool in the UK. We've got 12 of the top 100 world universities and 3 of the top 10. But we also have an excellent and growing technical education system. So we probably don't quite have 50% of our youth going into apprenticeships, but over the last 20 years, successive governments have made pretty significant investments in technical education and in apprenticeships. We have an excellent research base and pretty broad-based research base. We don't compete with some of my colleagues here on the panel in terms of the amount of money we spend per share of GDP on R&D, although that's something I'll come on to, we're trying to address. But we have one of the most productive research bases in terms of citations per dollar or per pound spent of any of our comparator nations. And the last thing to flag is that our research innovation base is inherently international in terms of the number of academics, researchers working in UK universities from overseas. That number is huge. We draw in proportionally more internationally mobile R&D than most other large countries. But at this point, I think I'd probably be remiss, and I'm probably not going to get out of the room without talking about it, remiss not to touch on Brexit and its impact. The referendum result in June 2016, still find it slightly hard to believe it was that recent, and the government's decision to leave the European Union. It's a big change with huge implications, and I think it's fair to say there's still a large degree of uncertainty about the terms of the exit and what that's going to mean for the UK and its future relationship with Europe, and that's something we're working through with our European counterparts. On innovation policy itself, I think the government has tried to set out a pretty clear position about where we want to end up. I think how we get there and the conversations with our European counterparts, that's still a work in progress. So we've set out the ambition that we want to remain a world-leading innovation nation. We want to continue to be a go-to place for scientists, technologists and entrepreneurs, and I think that's an important message for people who may have heard some of the message that Brexit means the UK isn't going to be open to business for scientists, for technologists, for entrepreneurs. The Prime Minister has been absolutely clear on this point. What the immigration system looks like, how we control our borders, that will come, but I think the principle is clear. We set a really clear position that we want to associate closely with the big European Union research and innovation program, so Horizon 2020 and its successor and others. And those discussions about how that works are still underway, and I can't kind of prejudge the outcome of them, but that's the position of the government. The last point I want to make in this section is all of this brings uncertainty, but a number of the kind of strengths and the foundations of the innovation system that I pointed to aren't going to change. Those things have been long-standing, and they will remain even as we negotiate a new relationship with Europe. I quickly just want to talk about a few of the highlights of what's happening in the UK policy landscape at the moment. Firstly, we have produced something called an industrial strategy, which I know is a term here in the US sometimes might come across as being a return to the old days of active intervention and industrial policy. It absolutely isn't. What it is a single cross-government articulation of the economy that we want to see and how we're going to get there. It's not about picking sectors or picking winners. It's about creating a supportive environment for industrial growth, for the economy to grow, and innovation is absolutely at the heart of that. In terms of R&D investment, I mentioned it earlier, the government has made a commitment to increase pretty significantly, I think it's the biggest increase in 40 years, our public investment in R&D, so an extra $9 billion over the next 5 years. And they've also made a longer-term commitment to get us to 2.4% of our GDP being spent on R&D, that's public and private, by 2027. So not quite competing with your 3.5%, Robin, but we're trying. And that tackles a long-standing, if you look at those numbers, that tackles a long-standing underinvestment in the UK, pound for pound or dollar for dollar, of how much we spend as a proportion of GDP compared to some of our comparator economies. And then the last thing I'd just like to highlight is we've just launched a major new reform in our funding landscape in the UK. We've created a new body called UK Research and Innovation, which came into effect the 1st of April this year. Why is that significant and important? Well, I think it's our attempt to bring all the research and innovation support and funding activity that's provided in the UK into a single organisation, so we can get better dividends from our research as it feeds into proof of concept, technology, spin out, and then application. So one of the challenges that we have in the UK is we're generally very good at research. We're generally very good at the early stages of application and commercialization. We generally aren't as good at taking those ideas and those small companies and creating they call them the kind of the unicorn companies, the $1 billion or £1 billion companies that you see a number of here in the US. And one of the challenges that UKRI is here to address is how we take our research and commercialize it, unapologetically for the benefit of the UK economy. But of course, we will recognise that innovation is inherently an international endeavour. So lastly, I just wanted to leave by kind of leaving a few challenges on the table that maybe we'll pick up in discussion or other panelists might want to respond to. I think some of these challenges are probably specific to the UK, but also I think some of them are shared and issues that we can all agree need to be thought about. The first challenge around innovation policy I'd highlight is sharing the benefits of innovation and innovation-led growth. So the UK has a number of world-class clusters of innovation. We've got life sciences and AI in Cambridge. We've got media and creative in Manchester. We've got smart cities in Bristol. We've got data analytics excellence in Edinburgh. But we have a catapult. Thanks, Stephen. We have a system of catapults which are designed to across the UK, which are designed to help take early research, early proof of concept technology, and provide government support and convening to get those spun out into application. And they sit across a whole diverse range of sectors and technology areas. And most people think of the UK, though, and they think of London and they think of the Southeast. And I think one of the challenges is how do we make sure that growth and innovation-led growth in the UK is shared across the country, and how is it shared between the urban centres and the rural centres? It's the first challenge. The second one, and I think Robin has sort of pointed to this as well, is how do you get the most out of public and private funding for R&D when it sits together? So I think I saw some stats that recently private investment in R&D in the US has recently taken over public investment. In the UK, about 70% of our, similar to Germany, I think from what Robin was saying, about 70% of our total investment in R&D comes from the private sector. And we've also set ourselves a challenge to get to 2.4% of GDP by 2027. That's public and private. So we're going to need to see a pretty significant increase in investment from the private sector as well as government stepping up. And I think the question is how do we harness both systems to best effect, recognizing that sometimes the interests aren't always aligned, but the total pound investment is massive and can have a huge impact. And then the third area I just briefly want to touch on is around emerging technologies. It's something Stephen asked the panel to think about in advance of the session. It's obviously certain emerging technologies are more topical than others at the moment, given what's happening around data, the Cambridge Analytica case, Facebook, and lots of conversations about AI and impacts, good and bad. But also, we need to be thinking around the corner. We need to be thinking about blockchain technologies and the extent of their impact. Quantum technologies, yes, maybe not quite ready for commercialization on the scale that maybe we're at with AI, but we're probably not that far off. And what's the UK perspective on the balance between supporting innovation and protecting consumers and regulation? And I think we're, as I mentioned earlier, I think we're pretty unapologetic about wanting to be the leaders in some of these emerging technologies. That was a big theme with the industrial strategy. And why? Well, we want to be able to generate the benefits from our excellent research base and have them return to the UK economy in terms of jobs, growth and economic security. That's important to us, but we're not thoughtless about the societal impacts and the, say, on AI, the ethical implications. So we recently set up a Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, which I think is the first of its kind in the world, which is looking at the balance between some of the issues around ethical application of machine learning, ethical use of data, but very carefully trying to think about this trade-off between supporting innovation and stifling innovation through regulation. That's a big issue for all of us, I think. I don't think this is a challenge just for the UK. So I'll end there, but hopefully I've given you a bit of a longer-term view of British innovation. I've given you some understanding of current policy, and I've given you a few challenges to think about and mull over, which I think are probably shared between a number of us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. So good. Thank you.
Good morning. Who's ever been to the Netherlands? Oh, wow. That's nearly everyone. Well, then I can go home. That's amazing. And I'm glad to see that. I'll first tell you something about the economic ties between the Netherlands and the US, because I think international cooperation is key in innovation, also in innovation policy and developing the policy. The Netherlands is not a very large country, but it's very densely populated. So we have about 17 million people on an area that's a bit bigger than Maryland. Economically, it's going very well. We have a budget surplus, which is a nice feeling nowadays. We're in the top 5 if it's about global rankings on competitiveness. For instance, for the World Economic Forum, we're number 4. We're in the top 5 of innovation rankings. We're doing and performing very well in that field. Between the US and the Netherlands is the 5th largest investor in the United States. That's partially because of our very large pension funds, so we invest a lot in the future of this country. The Netherlands is also the 2nd largest exporter of agricultural goods, and the United States is the 1st. We create with our companies 740,000 jobs in the United States, and that's still growing. We have companies like Philips, Shell, Unilever, but also the chips machine manufacturer ASML. Maybe you haven't heard of the name, maybe you have, but they own about 80% of all the chips machines that are made globally, and which determines in a way the future of our semiconductor industry, together with a lot of companies in this country. The US export to the Netherlands is $60 billion, but in the end there's a trade surplus in the advantage of the US to the Netherlands. And if we look at where do we also contribute if it's about innovation, hurricanes in New Orleans, New York, Houston, it's the Netherlands. Traditionally we're below sea level, so since the 17th century we have built up this expertise to not only survive but also flourish if you live below sea level. We help with our expertise and our ideas, not to copy-paste them in the United States, but to really look at how does it work here, what are the conditions, what are the requirements, what do people want, and then together with multi-parties here help to improve the system. And that's also one of the qualities of our way of thinking and working with innovation, to which I'll come later. Our companies invest about $2.3 billion annually in R&D in the United States. So Philips spends 40% of its global R&D in this country, and that's because there is top quality research in this country. So we both benefit, I think, from each other. The Netherlands is the 8th research partner with the NSF here in the US, and for non-European countries the US comes first as an R&D partner. And also very important in this case, the UK and Germany are our main trade partners, but also our main R&D partners if it's about cooperation. So it's one big global value chain sitting here, and without the European Union and the several framework programs on R&D, we wouldn't have had the impact as where we are standing right now. More specifically on innovation policy in the Netherlands, over the last, I think, nearly 10 years, or maybe even longer, we've been focusing on our key economic areas. We call them top sectors, varying from high-tech to agricultural food, life sciences, chemistry, so we've got quite a bit. Also logistics is a very important one to us. Those top sectors we complement with ICT, which goes across all these sectors, but also bio-based economy. So let's say we have a whole cross-sectoral and top sector approach on fostering innovation. We do that as a government, not by ourselves, by telling industry or whoever what to do. We ask them what they would like to accomplish within our country, but also within an international framework with international agendas. So these top sectors set together with our clusters and the government their agendas, strategic agendas, and the government funds a part of it, but also the private sector funds part of it, and our research organizations fund it. We are now gradually changing that approach. And why is that? Because what we see is that innovation changes. The requirements of society change. Our global landscape is changing. So gradually from a top sector approach we go to what we call an approach that's focused more on the societal challenges. To us, societal challenges like aging or climate change or cybersecurity, they are the business models of the future. So that's why we're changing our approach. And if it's about aging, because the population in Europe is what we call becoming grayer and grayer, we say we need healthy aging so these people can participate much longer in the workforce, for instance. And so we see the economy, society as a whole, and that's why we innovate on societal challenges. The key enabling technologies or the emerging technologies in our policy are extremely important. Because what we see is that not only these societal challenges are crucial, but we also see that innovation policy is gradually changing towards the need for a systemic approach. It's systemic innovation. If we're talking about what's happening globally, we also see that these disruptive technologies have a global impact. They have an enormous impact on society. We're just talking about AI, which will have probably make a major difference on the labor force. It will change also the way we communicate, how our decisions made. So that's why you need to look at innovation from a more systemic approach. Well, how do we do that? We think of, first of all, how to work with the regulatory environment. So not only reduce regulation. So for the last 10 years, we had a whole directorate questioning together with our public and the companies which regulation do we need to eradicate or change. But we also look at future-oriented regulation. So together with companies, with disruptive startups, like how can we gradually implement these technologies and these business models so you don't have to pull the brakes once they're there. We very often work with public-private partnerships. That comes natural in our country. That's probably also based on the historic effect of being below sea level. If there's a major threat, you have to unite, you have to join forces. So when something happens or we want something to happen, we gather everyone around the table and try to make it work. Share interests, share goals. It's a very good thing because you get a lot of support. The downside is it takes quite a long time. But once you have something, it can go a long way. We also see things as a value chain. In innovation, it's no longer about one company or about one university or one topic. All these things are interrelated. If we look at a company like ASML, they can in a way never be bought by any other country or company because they enormously depend on the whole value chain which is based in the Netherlands. At the same time, they can never operate very well without the input of companies like Intel or TSMC. They need to know what the customer wants. So the value chain is global, and that determines the future of the semiconductor industry. So Laws More, in a way, is based on what happens in Eindhoven together with all these stakeholders around the world. We work with bottom-up innovation. For us, it's very important that people innovate as well. So one of the topics and programs we've been working on, that's also now exported to the European Commission, is called the Green Deal approach. I was part of that whole development, where we ask local parties to come up with ideas to change, for instance, the use of energy, or change the use of plastics, or how to make your houses more sustainable. So they come up with ideas, and then our minister said, if these ideas are good, if these are scalable, if we can help them in any way, we will. So there's a large commitment from a ministry to make these programs work. And until now it has been an enormous success. That's how you can work bottom up with ideas, support from the government, and there's hardly any money involved. I think the disruption is a key issue, key topic for all innovation policy, and we're just at the starting point of that. I'm now, let's say, doing a whole survey what's happening in the US and Canada. My colleagues across the globe are doing that for Singapore, the UK, Germany, and you see this all developing, especially in the field of AI. Pooling that knowledge, I think, is crucial. The World Economic Forum is doing that in San Francisco, but I think we can do a great job by pooling that knowledge and see how we can develop AI in a very constructive way, both for industry, for economy, for society. This is a bit how innovation policy in the Netherlands work. Of course, we have a generic base, like most countries, tax incentives for companies. So the part of the wages that companies spend on R&D is tax deductible. We have many more specific targeted instruments for SMEs, for these top sectors. But in general, we think money's not everything. We will definitely not accomplish the 3 or the 3.5% in the next 5 years. But we think with smart ideas, you can do a lot with the commitment of people to really get these dynamics going. Startup Delta was one of them. That was also bottom up with the startups, with the investors, with the regulators, changing the system within the Netherlands and moving forward on a much larger and ambitious scale. This is a bit what I would like to describe. What are the economic ties between the Netherlands, the US, also the importance of Europe, but also that the way of thinking in innovation is crucial. We do it in one way, the United States does it in a different way, and I think we can learn a lot from each other, and looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Sigrid. That was great. Clemens.
Good morning, and thank you for having me today and giving me the possibility that hopefully by the end of this meeting you will leave this room and remember Europe, and especially Austria, as a global place of sparkling innovation, and not only Arnold Schwarzenegger, The Sound of Music, and Red Bull. Let me briefly introduce you where we are standing internationally when it comes to innovation. We're very closely entangled with the US when it's showing up in international rankings on innovation, like the ITIF innovation ranking 2 years ago, I think. Always around place 9 or 10. What we're doing well according to those rankings are especially education. We've got a very good education. We've got a dual apprenticeship program like Germany and Switzerland. But beyond that, we've got a very good workforce training, especially when it comes to IT and STEM education in companies after you leave school and you're working already. We're good at broadband access. We're excellent in autonomous driving, science and research publications. But the most important thing for us, it's not always the technical innovation. For us, it's very important also the rankings when it comes to quality of life, better life index of OECD. So Vienna has been rated the city with the best quality of life in the world for the last 7 years. So that's extremely important for us, how to measure innovation. We're talking about government today and what the Austrian government is doing for innovation. I condensed it to 3 pillars of what we're doing. And it's a very strategic role of support of the Austrian government for innovation. Sorry for the mic. And then talk a little bit about taxes and how we see taxes and an investment in the future of our country and in innovation. And, of course, regulation, as this, when it comes to Europe, is sort of a mantra here in all the ITIF meetings I luckily attend and happily. And I will start off with regulation, because it's very interesting. We had a short discussion before about regulators and legislating and administration. And when you look at the Austrian Parliament, there's no initiative whatsoever when it comes to innovation so far. And when it comes to government, the prime understanding of the role of government, as we heard already today, is support of innovation, because that's what we need. That brings development. This brings prosperity for us. With regulation, we still get along with the existing regulations for analog technologies, also with Bitcoin or ICOs, for example, that work fine with the regulations we have so far. What we do in regulation, we have this regulation, and new technologies innovation comes in now to improve services of the government, for example, to make the government process, to make all your contacts with authorities quicker, faster, more efficient, and cheaper, and thus making existing regulations even better. Therefore, we just recently introduced the chief digital officer in all the ministries in Austria that have to coordinate all those efforts. Of course, we're looking also into the future, and Sigrid mentioned that there's a need to look at future technologies and how we deal with them. We have to give innovation sort of a direction, of course. And we do this in an inclusive project. Austria likes to do that, to involve everybody. So we've got a lot of advisory councils to the government, also on AI, robotics, and so on, where all the stakeholders are involved, from industry to the civil society, and their aim is to find the right balance of interests between those groups. Very important for us, of course, is also to keep the ownership of personal data. With sandboxes are just one of the tools we are quite actively using too. Coming down of what we're doing proactively as a government. And it's typically Austria, but we heard it also from other countries here again. Whatever we do in Austria, at the end we have to have a strategy. And we have an STI strategy. The government published one in 2013. The current government is just adapting to that. And the prime objective of this strategy is to make Austria the innovation leader in Europe by 2020. One of the main tools, Robin was also pointing to that already, is we want to reach GDP ratio of our R&D expenses up to almost 4% in 2020. Right now we are at 3.2, so there's still a lot of work ahead of us for us. In addition to the government strategy, once again, inclusive process, Austria was one of the first countries in the world that published an open innovation strategy involving all the Austrian stakeholders in STI around the world, also through our office here in the US and, for example, in Canada, where experts, industry, also simple people, citizens could participate and have the contribution of how Austria should develop their innovation policy in the future. We are a small country, we have limited resources, so we have, of course, to focus on certain thematic areas. We don't have grand challenges, and that's an important element for us, of course, that we are part of the European research area and European research landscape. And our current government's focus right now is digitalization. And one of the first steps was just recently they announced a digital agency set up in one of our funding agencies. And this digital agency has the task especially to help small and medium-sized enterprises to have a plain sailing through the digital transformation in the future. Another central element, of course, is the international connections, like here with the US. The US is, for example, our second trading partner after Germany. So that's quite an important partner for us in all the fields. We don't have an institutional collaboration or cooperation with the US. It's always on an ad hoc basis, and that's why our office, for example, is also here. And of course, we have also an international strategy called Beyond Europe, where our office here plays a central part. Taxes, paying taxes. Nobody likes that, but in Austria there's a general consensus on that we see paying taxes for investing in innovation is investing in our future. And I just want to give you 3 examples of what the government is doing in supporting financially innovation, and the focus is fostering cooperation between industry and research, be it basic research or applied research. And the government is paying up to 6 million for 7 years cooperation between universities and companies, and there's also an international element. So even a US company or university could cooperate with an Austrian research lab or industry. And the other one is the government supports pilot factories. We're very strong in Industry 4.0, and that's very important for us for production. We're very strong in microelectronics, and production is and manufacturing is still an important element of our economy. And pilot factories are working, the government is paying, and universities and a couple of SMEs or companies are simply getting together to build up a lab or a factory where they can test Industry 4.0 in a realistic environment. And all these elements should make us then really by 2020 the innovation leader in Europe. And what I just told you, that's the official version, but the unofficial Austrian version is the main drivers of our innovation are excellent sweets, a good glass of wine, fantastic arts, and very creative people. And this brings me back again here to the US and our what can we learn from each other. It was an Austrian musician, Franz Liszt, who created or coined the motto to cast the javelin into the infinite spaces of future. That was DARPA, to pick that up as their leitmotif. Thank you.
Thank you, Clemens. That was great. And finally, Peter.
So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm the last speaker in this rather impressive series of panelists talking about giving you testimonials of innovation and innovation systems across Europe. We have heard from the bigger countries. We have heard also the last speaker from Austria, and I am from Austria, so I may say from a small country. So there's quite some variety. Now, I work for the European Union, and I would like to give you, and I'm afraid the time will not allow me to dive into all the length and breadth of what we are doing in the European Union in terms of innovation, but I want to give you two elements which maybe have not been touched so much at this stage. The first element I want to sort of see that you understand that the European Union innovation system is not the 29th system. It's a sort of where the 28 member states come together and identify those areas where they see collaboration is needed. Because particularly if you're a small country, and Clemens has been mentioning that, you will naturally have to go out. Your markets are first abroad, your relationships are abroad, and you will have to work also to attract talent from abroad or work with universities if you do research outside Austria. That's the most natural thing in a small country, and you can scale that to the level of Luxembourg if you want. I mean, it's like you can walk out of the country in every direction in half an hour, you know. So this is a fact of Europe, so therefore this cooperation is nothing exciting. I mean, it's just a natural need for this, which maybe is not as pressing in some of the larger member states. If you live in France, you may find a lot of resources at home. But for all the rest, this is daily business. Now, then, not surprisingly, a European Union innovation program actually came quite late. The research program, which member states have established, started in 1984. But the innovation program probably formally only, I would date it around 2002, which coincided as well with the change of the innovation landscape. Yeah, I'm sure many people remember the good old days of when large corporates had their own research center somewhere in a nice place out somewhere in the greenery. These times are gone. And that was around the early 2000s, at least in Europe, where these research centers were going out of fashion. We realized open innovation as the new model. So universities, corporates, startups, everybody opened up in terms of attracting talent, attracting ideas, working with others to see what is the next ball game they wanted to play. So that, again, was also the starting point for a European innovation program, which you have to see much more as a toolbox from which countries can pick. And I give you now a couple of examples of such toolbox elements. One, for instance, is when we talk about institutions. So the European Union has been funding and setting up European institutions relating to innovation. The European Institute of Innovation and Technology, for instance. Now, where the different domains are located is a bit up to the member states to choose. So you will find different geographies. There are certain strengths in the northern part of Europe, certain strengths in the southern parts. There are historical reasons. There are competences spread differently. And when I'm saying that, it's also sort of, we see innovation as something going across every industry. I mean, the most fantastic innovation when I started working for the Commission I saw was cork for bottles. You know, there used to be quite some fungi in those corks, which made the wine really taste bad, and the loss was only discovered at the end on the table when the wine was sold for $30 or $40. That was a high loss. Now that's actually, the patent is held by a Portuguese company, how to get rid of that fungi in there. We don't have corked wine anymore. Did you realize that the last 10 years? I'm sure you never saw one. Gone. A small innovation. So we like across, in Europe, innovation across all the board. There's maybe the high-tech stuff. Sigrid was talking about chip manufacturing. Really cool, but there's also the long tail of bringing innovation to everything at the end of the day. So I've been talking about that toolbox. There are other elements which, other elements in the part of that toolbox. Clearly one is the funding mechanism. So the European Union is sort of pulling a certain funding from the member states, which then is used in a flexible way to support startups, to support very large cross-country initiatives. and people have been talking about AI. The European Union has launched a strategy on AI. 24 member states so far have signed up to that strategy. And it doesn't need to be everybody. That's not the point. It needs to be those who are committed to work in this domain. And it's similar when it comes to connected and automatic driving, or it's similar when we talk about high-performance computing. It may not interest everybody, but there is a sufficient European critical mass, and we can push ahead as a large group then in this area. Now that was one thing, and I could talk about the toolbox for quite some hours because there are many elements in there. There's another point I wanted to make, which has very little to do with technology. I think there are many people who believe that regulation, by definition, stifles innovation. I mean, that's like seen as a mantra in some places, and people believe that. Now, I think we should spend a few minutes to I'm afraid if I could rather. I'm sorry. I think we should spend a few minutes to see if that relationship is really that hard and that true. Because in Europe, we are working very much on a regulatory side. You know, and I have been to a panel where Europe was called a regulatory superpower. I'm not sure if that was a compliment, but there's a bit of truth in that regulation is a major tool in Europe to work as a public sector actor. Now, it is true that regulation can stifle innovation when it is like adding cost simply, or just adding red tape to something. When, for instance, regulation is going into multi-sided markets. I mean, think about copyright, for instance. It's very difficult to make the win-win situation for everybody in some of those regulations. So there may be specific cases, but it's not true in every case. There's plenty of regulation which is supporting innovation. And we have this information only because the regulation is there. We don't have it. We wouldn't have it otherwise. And this is something I think we should recognize as well. And that's a role regulator and the public sector can play. And I'm picking yet again another controversial sector. For instance, if you talk about car emissions, in Europe we have this what's called a Euro norm. I mean, this car emission standards, which are getting more stringent every few years. Now we're at number 6 of the incarnation. 7 and 8 are already down the pipeline in terms of planning. So what we see is that cars use a lot less gasoline in Europe, and at the same time become a lot more powerful, those engines. So that is possible. That would not have happened if those rules wouldn't be there in place. I'm sorry, it would not have happened. And we see the effect in terms of cost for driving a car. We see the effect in terms of the environment, the green environment, less emissions. We see the innovation because these cars are much better or easier to sell, for instance, on Asian markets or over here because they're very innovative. So there it was clearly innovation which is driving that. You find it in other areas, and Sigurd was talking about societal challenges, in particular in these areas. You see that innovation can help. It's regulation related to food, prohibition of certain ingredients, which drives innovation of making food better, more qualitative, and less dangerous for people, if I may say so. And yes, I'm coming to the end. So there is this narrative as well that regulation can be supportive of innovation. This is something we should support. And as a European Union, we have committed, I'm closing here, we have committed to review every regulation we are issuing for its innovation impact. This is a new thing we only committed to last year. So in the process of drawing up, we really go through what does it mean for innovation. And the assessment may be not so good, but at least then we know how this regulation will go in those terms. And probably I have delivered enough food for thought at this stage and would like to leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. I understand that we may be hearing on Thursday more about the upcoming FP9 framework. I don't know if you would be able to make a comment on that or not, but if not, it's okay. We can take it to the panel.
Well, we just recently tabled, the European tabled its proposal for the financial period 21-27. So you see there quite some long-term thinking. Part of that is what you call the Framework Program 9, the next revision of the Research and Innovation Program. what has been proposed in there, and I think I would like to keep it short, is on the one hand, a stronger program in this direction, which means more money, but that's maybe not the most important thing. The most important thing is a more integrated version. So in fact, that much more of the budget of the European Union will be innovation or research and innovation related, also into other areas. And I give you an example how this could be done. I've been talking about high-performance computing. We're not thinking about supporting the chip manufacturing industry. This is not the point. We would like to procure 2 high-performance computers. Now, if you need 2 high-performance computers, you probably need some chips. Do they exist? No, they don't. Oh, okay, we have to talk to the semiconductor industry to get those chips done. Do they know how to do it? No, because there is new process technology needed. So you see that a procurement at that level goes down to creating the research and innovation necessary to deliver that procurement. And that is being done now in a couple of areas. You can talk about connected and autonomous driving. Connected means you have to connect your car to somewhere, to an infrastructure along the road. Does that infrastructure exist? No. Does 5G exist? Well, it's coming in. But that would be the place where we want to see it happen, along the motorways. So what does that mean in terms of research? What does that mean in terms of procurement? What does that mean of the innovation systems in those countries who would like to participate? So you will see in the next framework program much more sort of high-level linchpin chapters, like high-performance computing, or cybersecurity is another one, or like a connected automatic driving, and there is a whole load of others, who will serve as this starting point for driving the innovation and research in this area. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you very much, Peter. Yeah, it's going to be fantastic. FP9, I understand, raising funding to $20 billion, up to $92 billion over the period, with much more of a focus on innovation in addition to the research. So that's wonderful. We're also lucky to have Maria Lundberg from the Swedish Embassy in the room with us. And Maria, I just wanted to ask if you would take 2 minutes to give us the perspective from Sweden on innovation policy. Sure. You were Sweden was an original partner in this event, so I want you to have a brief form as well.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen. And this is very quick. I haven't really had a lot of time to prepare this here. Sweden is also a very small country, 10 million people, and we were about 5 million year 1900. And since we're so small, we had to go at export early on. And I mean, you have a number of companies, which is part of ABB, Volvo, Atlas Copco, Alfa Laval, Sandvik, etc. So that means that we were very early on exposed to competitive forces and also openness for new ideas. And I think that's part of what has created Sweden the way it is, this openness and always being involved and seeing what's happening. And of course now we rank very highly in almost all innovation indexes. We have companies like, whether it's you count number of unicorns or whether you count any kind of indexes. And we have, companies like Skype, Spotify, etc. Some of the, what we call them, societal pillars for providing an environment that is good for creating innovations that we often refer to is, of course, the high R&D, and we are well over 3%, as we have talked about before here. Also, opportunities for all. And that's kind of also crucial because that's how you can get everybody's ideas and not just, again, goes back to the openness and not just a single kind of group of people. And the opportunities for all, that means like education, for example, that is available to people. And we were, I think, very early on having more women who graduated from college than men. Daycare is another one. So you really have the ground that there is an opportunity for all. Another area is safety net. We have gone through a number of restructuring, like shipyards, for example, where we have learned from the lessons from that in providing a safety net. So how do you restructure? How do you get people trained very early on? And we have a very effective system of doing that, so people early on get into the new things. And that also means that you take away the fear for failing and the fear of the new future. So we more embrace the future and then what the new technology and what it means and what the opportunities are with that, rather than being fear of it. So I think that's kind of a big chunk of what makes Sweden Sweden in this area. We also have a close collaboration between the various parties, and we also have strong leadership in this area. So we have a National Innovation Council, which is actually led by the Prime Minister. And our Ministry of Enterprise is not Minister of Enterprise, it's Minister of Enterprise and Innovation. So I think that shows how strong this innovation aspect comes from the top. So Okay, just very quickly too, we started looking at innovation from the three challenges that we saw: digitalization, life science and health, and also sustainability. And out of that, we looked into what are the strategic areas where Sweden has strength. And we had identified 5 areas, and within those areas, we have then developed programs where we actually have a very strong, tight collaboration between the actors. One such area, just for an example, is life science. Another one is next generation travel and transportation. So these are areas where Sweden has strength, but where we also see a lot of development, and that's where we really focus on working together. So I think that's some of the very quickly some of the things that has made Sweden rank up very highly in this area. And thank you so much for.
Thank you, Maria. You really can't understand all the great things going on in innovation policy in Europe if you don't have a sense for what Sweden's been doing in this space and this sectoral approach to organize all key public-private actors in society to drive innovation is very thoughtful. So thank you, Maria. I really want to open it up to the audience with questions, so please, if you have any, raise your hands. Let's get there very quickly. While the audience is thinking of questions, I'll just maybe ask the panel. Coming out across all the speakers seems to be a focus on impact and moving from research to innovation and commercialization. Was there anything along those lines that struck you from what a fellow country was doing, or what do you think can be most effective for Europe in driving to kind of R&D efficiency and impact of R&D dollars to realizing innovation in the economy? Go ahead, Andrew.
Thank you. I think we all talked about the importance of spending money, and we all talked about where we're at in terms of R&D investment as a % of GDP. But it's not just about spending the money, it's spending the money well and having an impact, exactly as you say. And I was really struck, Sigrid, by what you were saying about the kind of value chain and the systems-based approach to thinking about innovation in the Netherlands. I think that's absolutely central. I think if you focus on the dollars or the pounds or the euros, excuse me, you kind of miss the point. And I think when you're thinking, about this event and about lessons learned from Europe on innovation policy, I think you can't take out an individual investment or intervention and say, that works, therefore we can take that and apply it somewhere else. You have to understand the system, the way the industry interacts with universities, the makeup of the industry, the makeup of the service of the economy. And I think that sometimes there's a danger that you can look at something that looks interesting and good from a policy point of view and try and extract it and implant it in another country. And I think it's just more complicated than that.
If I might add something to it, for us it has always been very important to look at other countries. Years ago I evaluated as part of the European Commission the Swedish innovation system. And we were very impressed by what was already then going on. But for Startup Delta, for instance, we looked at Tech City, which is an amazing example of what under Cameron has happened in London, I think, and attracted enormous investments, talent, startups, and looking at how it's developing. So, because we also wanted to step back from everyone said, oh, Silicon Valley, well, you can't copy it. You have to look at what are the conditions in your own country. You have to, let's say, change the way of thinking. It is also about attracting money, but the whole culture, the value chain, innovation is about much more than just investments. There are many factors that play a crucial role. And I think that is where different countries in Europe are a good example, but where we also look at the US, or even if you look at Startup Chile, what they managed to do. So we can learn a lot from each other. And that's what we're here for, of course.
Okay, let's take a question in the order I saw them. We'll go here, there, and to the back. If you would state your name and the organization you're with, please. Thank you.
Is it on?
Yes.
Steve Winters, independent consultant. I'd like to direct this question to Robin. It's my understanding that the Federal Ministry of Education and Research has been a sponsor of the so-called Sino-German Innovation Cooperation Conferences for the last couple of years. And yet at the same time, there's quite a bit of controversy in Germany now about exactly how far Germany wants to have cooperation in these areas with China. So could you give us an update on what's going on there?
So I think the discussion that we have in Germany about our scientific cooperation with China reflects in many ways the discussion the US have. So I don't see huge differences in the discussion, and I think the same thing happens that happens here. We don't have a real outcome at this point. So we have a growing awareness of what the challenges are, that technologies are important, that on the one hand you have to protect technologies, intellectual property rights. On the other hand, science is an international endeavor and you cannot just close your borders and not cooperate. There are certain steps, and I think the EU is also into that business in looking deeper into possible investments of China, strategic investments, and possibilities to regulate that or to have to see if it's really good to do it or not. But on the other hand, there is also, I think, a strong feeling that we cannot close our borders for scientific cooperation. But this is the discussion is just at the beginning, and if I talk to people here, my feeling is that we have a comparable discussion and the outcome is open. But you highlighted a very important point, and we see, and I think that became clear in this panel, we have to compete, we have to be better, we have to innovate, and we have to be strong ourselves. I think that's the best strategy.
Great, thanks. John?
You for coming here and speaking to us all.
The name and organization.
Oh, right, okay, sure. My name is John Santamaro. I'm with the research-based biopharmaceutical company AbbVie. Would it be helpful for me to stand up, maybe? And, you know, one of the things, because we follow a lot of innovation policy in the life sciences area, obviously, it's very important to us. And my company in particular has a big footprint across Europe. We have a lot of manufacturing there, R&D. It's one of our biggest markets as well outside the United States, so we're very committed to the European region. And I wanted to ask, one thing, though, that gives us concern is on the intellectual property framework in Europe, because this is something that's of critical importance to the life sciences sector, and we think currently the European system is excellent. It's very sophisticated, generally protects innovation very well, but we're seeing some developments now which may be rolling that back. And something you may be familiar with is an exercise at the European level known as the Pharmaceutical Incentives Review, and there's just been a proposal issued by the European Commission that would provide an exception to certain critical intellectual property rights in the pharmaceutical sector. In our area, that's called the Supplementary Protection Certificate. I could explain that, but it essentially is part of the patent right, if you will, in shorthand term. I just wanted to ask, because we're seeing positive developments elsewhere in competing economies like China, where they're increasing intellectual property protection, and specifically on this issue in the pharmaceutical sector. And one of the concerns we have is whether Europe may be retreating on that. But I wanted to sort of give you guys a chance to opine on that, because we're really looking at that very closely in the life sciences area. What do you feel is the relationship of intellectual property to innovation policy across Europe? And is there sort of a sentiment in Europe that maybe it's not so important or not as critical an element anymore, and is that what we're seeing? Or is this something that you believe is still held in high regard and very important, because that's something that's critical from our point of view? Thank you.
Should I get a go?
Sure. Go, Peter.
Well, I think to answer your question very, very briefly, I think intellectual property is still held very much as a treasure to Europeans. So there is no question that this regime we are running of very strong protection is going to change. However, as you say, the devil is in the detail, as usual. And I think what you see with IP protection as well, it's exclusive rights, generally exclusive rights for a certain party. Now, I think that as a concept will not change, but what the detailed rules on that are may be reviewed in the one or other sector and industry. So I'm not familiar with the specific case you're pointing out, but let me give you another one, for instance. I'm better versed on copyright. You know, copyright for performances is now 95 years. So you may want to question whether it is 95 years, why it is not 70 years, or why it is not 105, or so. So there are questions like that, which are not questions of principle, but a question of what is the optimal point for keeping an industry running at top innovation speed. And this is, I think, also something every industry needs to ask itself. And as a public sector, we do regularly review and go in and say, well, there needs to be changes here or there. There may be disagreement, and I'm not sure if we were to agree at the end of the day, but I think there's certainly no retreat from the general principles that intellectual property is a very, very important element of our innovation strategy, and we would never give up, and we'll loosen those at the cost of some short-term gains.
Can I add one thing to
Yes,
it in relationship to emerging technologies? And I recommend you to read a report that's written by the Center of the Fourth Industrial Revolution of the World Economic Forum in San Francisco. It's about AI and IP and how you can use a very strong AI strategy in IP to fence off certain areas, so that you can become world leading by having a very offensive IP strategy. I think it's a very intelligent document, and it also shows that IP policy is not over yet. Maybe it's only beginning. So it's a good point.
Hi, Catherine Catalano from the Union of Concerned Scientists. I wanted to ask about your thoughts on autonomous vehicle regulation. That's something that's on a lot of minds today. There are arguments from some that for the sake of roadway safety, we should be trying to get them on the roads as soon as possible. There are arguments from others also in relation to safety that we need to slow down and take our time and make sure there's the proper regulatory framework and all data is being shared and analyzed in a centralized place. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that kind of argument.
Clemens or Robin?
As I mentioned, autonomous driving before, it's very important for us, and we want to go down that road as quickly as possible. We've got quite an extensive regulatory framework already for testing autonomous driving in Austria. It's, I think, one of the best in Europe, where we have it already on public roads all along Europe. Getting a permission for that is rather easy. There's very clear-cut rules on that end. Vienna, transport in Austria is very public still. So most probably autonomous driving will be first introduced in public transport in Austria. So we will have autonomous trains rather soon, and the city of Vienna is also thinking of introducing autonomous buses, for example, already in the next 5 years.
Go ahead, Ron.
Can I? Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Yeah. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So Germans are considered that, to like their cars so much that they would like them to drive them themselves. So that may be an obstacle to autonomous driving. But I think we cannot just say we slow down something or we accelerate something. We have a technological development. I think my feeling is that in Europe there would be absolutely no acceptance if there is a sort of risk. So I think the car companies have to say this car is safe, point. And this is something that maybe you may call it risk averse, but my feeling is that in the US there is more feeling for, well, it's a work in progress and we have to test, and there are test beds in Europe as well. But my feeling is that it may be more difficult to bring the cars on the road in Europe. I think we shouldn't talk about regulation too much, but about standards. And it would be very important to have international standards of who is responsible, who is liable, and things like that. But I think no government would say, well, let's not bring them to the roads before 2025 or something like that. So the technological development is going on, and Germany is also heavily investing in autonomous driving.
I should also say we did a great event with Robin last year on comparing the German and U.S. regulatory environment to support the deployment of autonomous vehicles. That's online if you'd like to take a look at it. Go ahead.
Jim Stang, a question for Robin Mishra. You talked about reorganizations of German universities to meet the pressures of metrics. Obviously, there are good metrics and bad metrics, and the world university ratings metrics have some real problems. Is a German system to respond to just make the metrics look good, the schools look good by the metrics to keep the senior policymakers happy, or to try to create new metrics that do a better job of reflecting quality and excellence?
Thanks, James. And actually, I want to add one final question to this for all the panelists. That can be our wrap-up question as we're approaching the witching hour. But it would be on this question of metrics. We have now in place these national innovation strategies for a number of countries. We have targets that countries are trying to hit and certain percent of GDP. But how are you measuring the success broadly of your national innovation strategies or policies across your economy? What are the proof points that you're looking to hit to say whether or not a strategy you put in place is successful or not? And then we need to go back and take a look at it if you're not delivering the results.
Well, I don't know exactly to which metrics you're relating. What I was saying is that German universities are generally too small to appear in all these rankings. If you, for example, take the Max Planck Society and would count them as one university, they would be easily in the top 10. So this is not a metrics that is kind of important for us. Every year, people or journalists are writing, well, Germany doesn't have a university in the top 10, but that's not achievable. So that doesn't mean that we don't have ways to measure success, and the excellent strategy that I mentioned is something that is really measuring success, because you give money to universities and to parts of universities who have proven to be excellent. And Bettina from the German Research Foundation is here. She can explain it better to you, but this is really a peer review process, and it's very complicated to be accepted, and that's a metrics that is generally accepted. I was only talking about the size as a metrics, and that doesn't work for German universities, and I think it doesn't make sense in our system to work on that. The clusters are part of this excellent strategy. So there is money for clusters of several universities, or can be universities and companies, and if they achieve something, if they are rated as excellent research, they can get money through the excellent strategy. That's the metrics that I mentioned.
To my final question, let me also add: is there any advice from your experience that you would give to U.S. policymakers on innovation? So take the final question: either any advice you would have for American policymakers on innovation, or how you're considering measuring your success.
All right, let me start. I think measuring success, are you measuring impact? Are you measuring outcomes? So I think it's always questions of a system which has a runtime of like the relationship between input and output is like 20 years, So I think what is certainly important is measuring outcomes. I think this in the European Union we really try to implement. So we look at what IP is being generated. We look at firms growth, firms generation, investments. So GERD measurements, and these are the sort of outcome measurements where you have immediate indicators whether we consider that the policies are moving in the right direction. Now, what impact they have, and impact is measured, I think, in a very different way. Impact is quality of life, is employment. Those are indicators for the impact we would like to see. And now the relationship between the outcome and the impact is yet another question. But I think over the last, let's not make it that long, but 50 years, we have seen a relationship, and therefore I think as policymakers we see that it makes sense to invest.
Okay.
I fully agree on the indicators there, economic indicators, you can say. We also, of course, look at the number of patents Austrians have, or the number, how it's increasing. Recommendations to policymakers, of course, the most important thing is innovation is not a linear process sometimes, so basic research remains important, and support for basic research, that's what we see in our everyday work. And, of course, evidence-based political decisions are the most important.
About metrics, well, this has been going on for decades, this discussion. We look at several things. When it's purely about innovation policy, the economic impact, it's about, of course, investments is very important, quotations of research, IP patents, but we also look at the amount of partnerships. As I explained, partnerships, public-private partnerships are very important to us. And gradually we now see it developing more towards also sustainability, the impact of climate, the footprint, so you get a more integrated approach also on how to see innovation and the impact on society. So it's, let's say, the indicators are broadening. Yeah, that's, I think, for indicators the main thing.
Yeah, for us in the UK, the industrial strategy sets out pretty clearly that the impact that we want to achieve through innovation is growth, jobs, and a prosperous economy. And the work to translate that into a set of metrics is the work that's underway at the moment. And I suspect that this is an area where we could all learn a heck of a lot from each other by comparing some of the methodologies and ways we actually think about this, because it's pretty complex and there's quite a lot of room for unintended consequences of targets and metrics. On your question about advice for US policymakers, Stephen, I would actually just say do more of these kinds of things. I think within Europe and actually between Europe and the US, we look at each other's systems and policies quite a lot and think about what we can learn from others. And I think that's a dialogue that it would be great to see more of between the US, between Europe, and something I'm sure all of us here would be happy to keep supporting in the future.
Last word, Rob?
Okay, so as I'll be leaving this year, I may give a more direct remark. It's more personal remark. I think we have seen two things that we have in common. So I think all our systems see a strong support for a government role in innovation. I think that's important to mention. And the second thing is that all our governments have kind of a national strategy and are defining strategic areas. And I think one of the most important points is that all our countries have secretaries of science and innovation. And they are sitting around the table with our respective heads of government, and they're raising their voice. They are part of the government on this cabinet level. And why don't you try that in the US?
Fantastic. And the point about stability, consistency, and certainty in funding, certainly something we called for, like Manufacturing USA, and making sure there's a continuing government role to fund those institutes. Well, I just want to close. I think it's been a fantastic panel. It's been great to hear about the institutional innovation we see across Europe and Germany, looking at DARPA, RBE, the Center for Data Ethics in England, as well as UK Research and Innovation, new institutional societal approaches from Holland and the EU. We heard about the role of regulatory environments to create enabling environments for innovation-based industry, regulatory sandboxes. The Green Deal I thought was quite interesting as well, Sigrid. From Austria, this role of digitalization, this chief digital officer in every agency of the government, something we've long called for ITIF, absolutely fantastic. From Sweden, the sector-based approach to driving innovation across core sectors of the economy. So I think it's been a very rich discussion. I want to say that what we're going to do at ITIF is write this event up into a set of notes, which we'll email to everybody afterwards, so you have a sense of what was discussed. Also, the video will be posted online within 24 hours. And I would like to close then by saying thank you to our audience for joining us this morning, and to our wonderful panel of Robin, Andrew, Sigrid, Clemens, Peter, and as well as Maria for stepping in for Sweden. Thank you all very much.
I hope you liked it.